Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy Earth Month. My name is Madison Mayhew. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the federal policy advocate with Interfaith Power and Light. Thank you so much for joining us today as we define a faithful farm bill to protect our climate. Together, we're going to cover the scope of the farm bill, learn its climate implications, and why people of faith are called to action. As you join, please introduce yourself by dropping your name in the chat with your congregation affiliation or faith tradition and where you're joining us from. As we begin, I want to thank our partners who joined with Interfaith Power and Light to make this presentation possible. Many thanks to Creation Justice Ministries, the American Friends Service Committee, Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, Jewish Earth Alliance, United Women in Faith, and the Environmental Working Group. As part of our time together, I want to acknowledge that where we are in Washington, D.C., as in every other part of our country, we are on Indigenous land. I recognize that I live and work within the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank people. I acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these peoples, and I am grateful for their stewardship of these lands. And I invite you to place in the chat the name of the people whose land you rely upon. Before we begin the program, a couple of housekeeping notes to keep in mind. Attendees are muted and can't unmute. Please use chat for comments and then use the Q&A feature for questions. If you're not familiar with the Q&A feature, you will see a button on the lower part of your screen that says Q&A. And we will have time near the end of the program to address some of your questions. Thank you so much for joining. And now I'm going to pass it to Derrick Weston, Creation Justice Ministries Theological Education and Training Coordinator, to lead us in a reflection.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to hear more of what has to be said, so I'm going to keep this brief. There's an old story that I imagine you all have heard. There was a man who had a piece of land that had been in his family for generations. He and his ancestors had lovingly tended to that land and built their lives around it. A wealthy man saw the land and approached the man about buying it from him. The first man refused the wealthy man, telling him that this land had been cared for by his family for generations and he couldn't bear to part with it. The wealthy man went away upset, likely unused to people saying no to him. He told his friends about the interaction, and the friends decided that they would help the wealthy man get a hold of this land that he wanted. They conspired and set up the first man, forced him off of his land, and ultimately, the first man ended up dying with nothing left. This story is the story of Naboth's vineyard, found in the Hebrew scripture in 1 Kings chapter 21. It's this event that sends the prophet Elijah into action. It's also believed to be the story that is referenced in Micah chapter 2 when the prophet says, "Woe to those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house and people and their inheritance." While Micah may have been referencing Naboth, it's easy to imagine that this situation was common enough that he could have been referring to any number of family farms being swallowed up by the powerful cross-national interests. In the biblical prophetic tradition, the health and well-being of a nation was directly tied to the well-being of farmers. When farmers were treated equitably, the land was healthy, people had the food they need, and the nation thrived. When the gap between the wealthy and poor widened and more land ended up in the hands of wealthy monocroppers, then the prophets appeared. And this shouldn't surprise us. As we learn more about who is doing agriculture well in our society, we see that what is good for farmers is also good for animals, and good for the land, good for the water, good for the air, and good for us consumers. Those of us in the Christian faith recognize that Jesus' day was one of those times when those who worked on providing food for the empire were on the bottom of the social ladder. Is it any wonder that a third of Jesus' disciples were fishers? We still see in our culture that people who work closest to our food are among the most vulnerable in our society, and that our food system's mistreatment of them is often deeply connected to our abuse of the land. So as we think of the role of the community of faith in helping to shape a farm bill that both serves the land and those who work it, I want to leave us with a blessing from Gary Naphan's excellent book, Jesus for Farmers and Fishers, Justice for All Those Marginalized by Our Food System. It is a blessing that plays on the words of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, especially at the margins of the greatest surplus of food in the history of the world. Blessed are those who flip burgers in fast food drive-ins, who fill burritos in taco trucks, or who go from house to house with coolers of homemade goods hidden in their trunks. Blessed are those who patch together their shelters from pallets and tarps. Blessed are those who glean their meals from the produce dumped on the edge of fields. Blessed are those who are famished and fatigued when nightfall comes. Blessed are those who pray for Jesus to arrive with fresh loaves and fishes. Blessed are those who live with the fear that Immigration and Naturalization Service will show up with handcuffs and paddy wagons to deport them. Amen. I will now pass this on to Scott Faber.
Wonderful. And thank you, Derrick. That was really wonderful. My name again is Scott Faber. I work for the Environmental Working Group. I'm also an adjunct law professor at Georgetown's law school, and I've worked on many farm bills. And so my job today is to just provide a brief introduction to the farm bill, and I'll try to do that quickly so that we leave lots of time for questions. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. All right. So I know a lot of you have heard that the Farm Bill is a bill that Congress works on every 5 years, and it does cover, the Farm Bill does have 12 titles, but most of what the Farm Bill does is 4 things. And this pie chart will help you all understand what it does. Most of what the Farm Bill does is related to anti-hunger assistance programs. More than 80% of expected spending for the Farm Bill, the one that will expire at the end of September and has to be renewed by the end of September, most of the funding that will be provided through the Farm Bill goes to anti-hunger assistance programs, in particular through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. The rest of the Farm Bill, a little bit less than 20% of the Farm Bill, flows to farmers, and about 11% of that funding, the blue and orange parts of this pie chart, flow to farmers in the form of subsidies. A smaller part of it flows to farmers in the form of conservation payments to farmers to help improve the environment. The gray and purple parts of this pie chart. So for the balance of the next few minutes, I'll help introduce you to subsidy programs, the commodity programs and crop insurance programs that are the blue and orange parts of this pie chart, as well as the conservation programs, the stewardship programs that are so important for helping farmers reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build soil carbon. As you can already decipher, there are 2 kinds of farm subsidies. There are commodity subsidies that flow to a select list of crops, primarily corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, rice, and peanuts. And most of those subsidies not only flow to a handful of crops, they flow to mostly to a handful of states, primarily the Midwestern states. There are also crop insurance subsidies. Those subsidies are available to many more farmers and make up a bigger share of our farm safety net. But there are some important differences between commodity subsidies and crop insurance subsidies. Before I get into those differences, one thing that often is a little confusing about our farm safety net is that farmers are eligible for both commodity subsidies and crop insurance subsidies, and often get paid twice or even 3 times for the same loss. As you can see from this map, many of those farmers who are getting paid 2 or 3 times for the same loss are again located in the farm states that you would assume most farm subsidies flow to. But there are some important differences between commodity subsidies and crop insurance subsidies. Commodity subsidies, again, those are the subsidies that flow to a handful of crops, corn, soybeans, cotton, wheat, rice, et cetera, are subject to a payment limit. So there's a limit on the amount that a farmer can receive. They're also subject to a means test. So farmers who are doing extraordinarily well, who have very high levels of farm household income, become ineligible for commodity subsidies. And we know who receive commodity subsidies. If you go to EWG's website and look at our farm subsidy database at farm.ewg.org, you can see who receives commodity subsidies. None of those things are true for crop insurance subsidies. crop insurance subsidies are not subject to any kind of payment limit. Indeed, there are some folks who receive more than $1 million a year from the government to help buy crop insurance. They're not subject to a means test, so farmers and business owners remain eligible for these insurance subsidies regardless of how wealthy they are. And lastly, we don't know who gets them. We have no way of knowing who receives these subsidies. And again, farmers can and often do receive both commodity subsidies and crop insurance subsidies. Because of the design of these programs, because they are tied to either how much you produce or tied to the amount of revenue you earn, the largest, most productive operators, the most successful operators receive the lion's share of farm subsidies. Again, this is from EWG's Farm Subsidy Database. What this chart tells you is that the top 10%, if you look down the left-hand side of your screen and stop at 10%, what you'll see is that the top 10% of subsidy recipients receive almost 80% of all subsidies. So this is over the period of 1995 to 2020. If you just look at the most recent year, it's still largely true. The top 10% of farmers who receive payments in 2020 or 2021 received the lion's share, almost 80% of farm subsidies. The bottom 80%, the farmers who are the smaller operators who produce less than their bigger neighbors, generally receive about $2,000 per year. So relatively speaking, very little. And as you can imagine, when your larger neighbor is receiving tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in subsidies, and you're receiving a few $1,000s a year in subsidies, that creates a particularly unfair playing field. The same sort of disparity is also exists for crop insurance subsidies. As I mentioned, for commodity subsidies, the largest 10% receive almost 80% of all farm subsidies. Same is true by and large for crop insurance subsidies. And here I just want to pause to say that crop insurance subsidies are not like insurance subsidies like that you would buy, like insurance payments you would make to buy a homeowner's insurance or car insurance. These are policies that insurers sell to you that where you pay, the farmer pays roughly 40% of the premium, and the government pays roughly 60% of the premium. But it's typically not insurance like you would think of, insurance to cover a loss from hail or from a flood or something like that. Most of these policies are subsidies that are designed to protect you from drops in your revenue. And so as a result of that, the largest, most successful farmers here again collect the lion's share of the premium subsidies. The top 10% receive almost 60% of all premium subsidies. The top 5% receive almost 36% of all premium subsidies. And what the chart shows you is that the top 1%, if you go all the way to the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see that the top 1% of farmers got about $41 an acre, while the bottom 50%, if you go to the left-hand side of the chart, receive about $22 per acre. So again, again, you can imagine if you're one of the large farmers and you're one of the small farmers, the larger farmers who are getting about $41 an acre to buy crop insurance have a disproportionate advantage to the smaller farmers who are getting about $22 per acre to buy crop insurance. Most of these subsidies go to farmers producing feed, not food. This chart, again, this is for 1995 to 2020, shows that about 44% of all commodity subsidies flow to farmers producing corn and soybeans, producing animal feed. And only 7%, as you can see, receive payments to produce food, the things we eat, fruits and vegetables. The same is largely true for crop insurance subsidies. Again, in this case, almost 56% of all subsidies go to farmers producing feed. Again, only about 7% of crop insurance subsidies goes to farmers who are producing fruits and vegetables, or the things that we eat. And that's the case even though most farms aren't producing corn and soybeans. As this chart shows, only about 31% of our farms are actually producing corn and soybeans. Most of our farms are producing other crops. The reason for this, and when you talk to members of Congress who are defending this system of providing largely unlimited subsidies to the largest producers of primarily feed grains, corn and soybeans, the justification for this disparity is that we are feeding the world. You'll hear over and over Republicans and Democrats, policymakers from across the political spectrum saying, well, these subsidies are necessary in order to feed the world. In fact, most of while our farmers produce a lot of food, they're not feeding the world. We produce a relatively small share of the world's wheat, an even smaller share of the world's rice. We do produce a bigger share of the world's corn, but still not most of the world's corn. And again, a relatively small share of the world's oilseeds or soybeans. And when you look at where we do send our food exports, we're not feeding the world. We're sending most of our food exports to wealthy countries. And in particular, most of our food exports are animal feed. So we're growing feed that is fed to animals in other countries. We're exporting a lot of meat and dairy. Less of what we export are fruits and vegetables and food grains. And when you put it all together and look at our top 20 export destinations and those countries in the world that are most in need of our food exports, you see that we're indeed not feeding the world. We're actually just feeding the wealthy, and we're mostly feeding them meat and dairy products or animal feed to produce their own meat and dairy products. So I'll just say a few words about the challenge that posed by greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. This is a big challenge. Agriculture right now produces about 11% of US greenhouse gas emissions. Most of those emissions are nitrous oxide emissions, the orange part of the pie chart on the right. Those are emissions that are caused from applying chemical fertilizer to farm fields that then goes up into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, as well as methane emissions. So methane emissions from animals and their waste. Very little of agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions are carbon dioxide emissions, or what you would normally worry about when you worry about greenhouse gas emissions. Again, they're overwhelmingly more than 90% of the emissions from agriculture are nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer applications and methane emissions from animals and their waste. But unlike every other sector of the economy, agriculture's emissions are going up. Emissions from, in particular, electricity generation and the transportation sectors have been going down. And if things stay on the course that they're on, agriculture's share of US emissions will increase to 32% of US emissions by 2050, or will be the single largest share of US emissions by 2050. So let me just say that again, because if you remember nothing else, right now, agriculture accounts for about at least 11% of US greenhouse gas emissions. If we stay on the path we're on, where agriculture's emissions more or less stay the same, and emissions from every other sector goes down as much as expected, especially from energy and transportation, emissions from agriculture, again, primarily nitrous oxide and methane emissions, will account for 32% of US emissions by 2050, or again, be the #1 source of US greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not just terrible news for our climate, it's also terrible news for our farmers. No one wants to be the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's the bad news. The good news is that there's been some analysis recently done by the Boston Consulting Group that shows that helping farmers adopt well-known practices that reduce emissions associated with how they use fertilizer, that change how they feed animals, that change how they store and handle animal waste, that change how they till the soil and take other steps to plant trees and grasses on marginal lands, that adopting a suite of well-known practices could dramatically change that picture, so that by 2050, agriculture is only 21%, not 32% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, farmers are eager to help share the cost of practices that reduce those greenhouse emissions. The challenge we face is that most of the funding that we are providing to farmers to help the environment is not going to farmers who are offering to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as this chart shows. And you can look more closely at this data at a different database we've built at conservation.ewg.org. As this chart shows, more than 70% of the funding that we provide to farmers through our biggest stewardship program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, more than 70% of that funding is going to practices that do nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Only 23% of the funding that we provide through this our primary farm stewardship program is going to reward farmers when they take steps to reduce nitrous oxide emissions or to reduce methane emissions. 5% of the funding that we provide through EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, is actually going to practices that increase greenhouse gas emissions, which, of course, given the challenge we face, doesn't make much sense. There's also we're also missing an opportunity with regards to one of our other big conservation programs, the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a program that pays farmers to plant grasses and trees instead of growing crops mostly on marginal farmland. Unfortunately, those contracts that we enter into with farmers are usually only for 10 years. And at the end of the 10-year period, the farmer is free to plow up that land and release all the soil carbon that may have built up and back into the atmosphere. So there are some opportunities to make better use of those dollars through the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, as well. So let me just say a few things about some of the priorities that we've set for the Farm Bill. One is we've certainly at the top of everyone's list, I'm sure on this call, is protecting SNAP. Sure, all of us heard yesterday Speaker McCarthy call to reduce anti-hunger assistance for hungry people as part of any agreement to raise the debt ceiling. 24 members of the House have introduced a bill to put new restrictions on SNAP. Many of those members of Congress not only receive farm subsidies themselves, but represent farmers who have received a subsidy payment for 37 straight years, but seem to think the biggest problem facing our farm policy makers is that we're feeding too many hungry people. I'm sure many of you disagree with that. We also need to do more to support our family farmers. In particular, we need to make sure that we put limits on subsidies so that the largest, most successful farmers don't have a competitive advantage when they are competing with their smaller neighbors. And in particular, we need to have meaningful limits on who can receive subsidies, as well as the amount that you can receive. And we need to know more about who's receiving those subsidies. We also need to make sure that we protect the climate smart funding that was provided in the Inflation Reduction Act. As many of you know, the Inflation Reduction Act provided $20 billion in climate smart funding. That's $20 billion in new funding to reward farmers who are taking steps to reduce nitrous oxide emissions or methane emissions. Many members of Congress are now proposing to cut that funding in order to, you guessed it, increase subsidies. Especially subsidies to the largest, most successful farmers. So that's going to be a big challenge for us in this Farm Bill cycle. And then the last thing we need to do is, as I've just talked about, ensure that most conservation funding reduces greenhouse gas emissions and helps build soil carbon. And at a minimum, we certainly shouldn't be using scarce conservation dollars to fund practices that increase greenhouse gas emissions. I think we'd all agree that doesn't make much sense. So let me stop there and give it back to Madison. And I want to make sure we preserve lots of time for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Now we'll pass it on to Karyn Bigelow with Creation Justice Ministries to give a faith framing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madison, for the introduction, as well as Scott for your insight on the Farm Bill. And so, having heard everything that Scott said about the Farm Bill, especially making it tangible towards those of us who really center our work around environmental justice and climate climate and agriculture issues, I wanted to come and just talk about why should we as faith communities actually care about this issue, talk about the Farm Bill. Many of us live in areas where we are very much removed from farms, and yet the Farm Bill touches us and those who we care for on a daily basis. And so with the Farm Bill, I just wanted to talk about some of the tenets that our faith communities have that very much are touched by the Farm Bill in some way. The first being a care for creation, a mandate to be stewards of the earth. USDA is one of the largest landowners, stewards, and managers of land in the US. And so this is an issue where we are very much needing to be caring for the land, because the Farm Bill has the ability to really influence what happens to land. Also, another tenet is that we're supposed to seek justice. This Farm Bill can really have the influence to be able to look at how are farmers treated? How do we have justice and equity for family farms, especially those that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color farms? Many of them have been in the process systemically and legally losing land. And so how do we have a Farm Bill that really seeks justice? It seeks equity. It seeks to actually give people the funding and the resources needed in order to keep their farms or to even acquire more land for those who want to grow. And another thing, we have a mandate as people of faith to feed the hungry. The Farm Bill, as mentioned, also covers nutrition programs that very much impact households who need it the most. And so that is another aspect of it. And then also, and this is where it becomes more of a theological framing, but there's so many scriptures, especially in the Hebrew text, that talk about looking out for the widow and the orphans. And the way that I like to interpret it is the widow and the orphans back then were those who were most susceptible to hunger and poverty in their society. And so honestly, I see that as a call to really take care of those who are most susceptible to hunger, to poverty, to the ills of society. And so having that call, the Farm Bill is really that place where we can, as faith communities, use our civic duties and our civic accountability to be able to challenge people to look at how our farm system is taking care of God's people and taking care of God's planet as well. And this also means looking at policies and advocating for policies that our food and agriculture system is vulnerable to climate change. And knowing that is one of the leading contributors to the climate crisis. As Scott said, right now it's at 11%, which is still a very big percentage. But if our system is not making changes, it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem for us. As other industries do the work to be able to bring down emissions, we need to be calling on our government to make the policies and the legislation necessary that will really help us to seek caring for the planet through conservation, through the reduction of emissions. And so that's another thing that we should deeply care for and address as we look for a farm bill that will, again, take care of God's people and God's planet, as many of us in our faith traditions have been mandated to do. Next slide. And so because we are people of faith, we have literal faith principles that for the Farm Bill that we want to see. We have collectively, as different organizations, come together to say, to speak truth to power, to be able to say, these are the principles that we believe are necessary and very much a call from God to our decision makers to be responsible for. And so the first principle that we have is, starting with the F, is frontline, and looking at wanting to see our communities that are frontline BIPOC communities of color, elderly, youth, and or disabled communities being centered in the policy work. Too often these populations are left out of considerations, and things tend to be even worse when people fit within multiple identities of these populations. And so in our principles, we advocate for things such as respecting Indigenous wisdom. We want to see that there's support for farmers who have been historically marginalized in the agriculture sector, and to see that the US government take the steps in order to right a lot of the wrongs that have happened. And we want to see programs fully funded, such as SNAP, which help provide healthy and nutritious food for historically marginalized, low wealth communities, often on the front lines of climate, who are often also on the front lines of climate change. Accelerate the transition to a sustainable agriculture system that supports small and medium holder farmers and local food economies. For us, this means that we want to see an acceleration in putting emphasis towards programs that will help farmers to transition to more sustainable practices, more regenerative practices. This means being able to improve access to markets that many local small scale and medium scale farmers do not have access to, because unfortunately the way that our system is currently had, as Scott mentioned, it is incentivized to have bad practices. And so how can we really show that how can we have policies that incentivize and show that it is still profitable to do what's right for the planet and for the biodiversity and for, the planets and all of God's creation. And we also want to see an investment in conservation programs, invest in climate resiliency and diversify crop insurance. We want to see, again, an investment, knowing that climate change is happening, knowing that it's causing more natural disasters to happen. There needs to be protections that help to build in the resiliency, especially at the farm level. But we also need to see not only that, but if farmers make the transition to sustainable farms, if farmers also experience natural disasters, that they are not going without, that they can still put food on the table. And so that means that we need to have crop insurance that protects not just farmers of monoculture farms, which are bad for the planet, but also how can we make sure that there's protections for farmers who are doing the right practices, those farmers who are doing regenerative practices and really doing what is best and really mimicking nature in their processes. Transform farm subsidies from supporting majority commodity crops to more specialty crops. And so again, we're wanting to see transitions happen at the farm level. We want to be able to see that good practices, which include biodiversity, means that there are farms that have not just one type of crop, but instead multiple ones. There's a system and a way for it to be done that has been done for centuries by many different communities, especially within Indigenous traditions. And so how can we make sure that, again, we are incentivizing and transforming farm subsidies so that they're supporting, again, good practice as opposed to monoculture, which is just, again, depleting of the soil and the earth. And then lastly, the tenet that we want to bring forward is to honor creation through the protection of land, the elimination of food waste, and the reduction of harmful farm practices that result in high greenhouse gas emissions. And so for us, we have to honor God's creation, and that means part of that honoring is to make sure that from the farm all the way to the table to even the waste bin, how are we honoring, how are we not wasting, but instead being stewards of the resources that we have that are very much, limited, and being stewards of them. And so those are the tenets that we have for the work that we want to do. This is what we're asking people to support when it comes to faithful principles for the Farm Bill that we've collectively done. We would love to hear from you all in the comments. Can you say which one of the principles really just resonate with you, which ones speak to you and that you really are passionate about, and really think that, of course, we should be highlighting all of them, but which ones just really resonate with you when it comes to moving forward as we do Farm Bill advocacy. Yes, I see honor creation as being one of them. That definitely, as someone at Creation Justice Ministries, that definitely resonates with me. But please keep putting your comments in the chat function, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Panel, who will then go and talk more about, or I'm sorry, she will lead the Q&A that will happen. And we're also going to bring Scott back to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Karyn. Hi, everyone. Like Karyn said, I'm Panel Ibe with the American Friends Service Committee, and I will be helping shepherd along the Q&A questions. So we do have a bunch of questions that have been put in the Q&A, and so rest assured, if you put a question there, it will be addressed. We also ask that if you do still have more questions, you can pop them there. What I will be doing is grouping questions that are similar in style so that Scott can answer a specific theme at a time and not individual questions in the interest of time. And so just be patient with us as we go through them, but we'll start with some of the questions that we've already gotten. So Scott, a couple of questions have come around the contributions to emissions from the agricultural practices. Particularly, folks want to know what percentage of it is transportation, so during the production piece of it. If you have any estimates that are linked within that space of processing and delivery to the markets, and whether that 11% that you told us is true impact of, growing, or it is mostly economic activity around growing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I always say at least 11% because the estimate of emissions that we get from EPA's greenhouse gas inventory does not include the emissions associated with transportation or the emissions associated with producing fertilizer, which can be very significant, and producing manufacturing fertilizer. And one of our colleagues, Peter Lehner at Earth Justice, has done an estimate we'll put in the chat that shows that the actual likely emissions associated with agriculture is more like 20% of U.S. emissions, not 11% of U.S. emissions. But that's we use 11% in part because that's the sort of the measurement that EPA provides in consultation with USDA, and that's ultimately the estimate that the modelers use to predict who will be the largest share of emissions over the next few decades, and allows us to make a prediction that agriculture will ultimately be 32% of U.S. emissions by 2050 if we stay on the course that we're on. Again, that does not include, and that's why it's such a great question, all of the emissions that would be associated in particular with the manufacturing of fertilizer, which can be a very large source of greenhouse gas emissions as well.
Thanks, Scott. The questions are pouring in. I will see. So another question that's coming up is the subsidy issue. Most folks are asking the strategy to shift the subsidy problem. So what kind of strategies are in place that have been able to shift subsidies from those who don't need them to those who need them and deserve them but are underserved? And so I think that would be a first question that I will ask.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the disparity within our subsidy programs has actually gotten greater in recent years as our farm safety net has relied more and more on insurance subsidies rather than traditional commodity subsidies, which are tied to a price that's set in the statute, and that's in part again because those crop insurance subsidies are not subject to any means test, so anyone, regardless of wealth, can receive those subsidies, and they're not subject to a payment limit. So not only can anyone receive them, there's no limit on the amount that anyone can receive. And that as a result, you do have the largest, most successful operators in the country, oftentimes receiving more than $1 million a year in assistance to buy crop insurance. One of the ideas that's been proposed, in particular by Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire, is to simply put limits on who can receive those subsidies, to say, okay, well, the means test that we have for commodity subsidies ought to also apply to crop insurance subsidies, and to put limits on the amounts that we can receive, so that there's a cap of $125,000, as there is for commodity subsidies, on the amount that a farmer can receive, and to close loopholes that allow people who don't even live or work or contribute any meaningful labor to a farm to receive subsidies. Unfortunately, there are tens of thousands of folks who live in cities and aren't connected to agriculture in any way, who have somehow found a way to finagle farm subsidies. So those are some of the ideas. We expect that Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who's been a longtime champion of many of these reforms, to also carry similar legislation in the House. He's introduced a sweeping reform package called the Farm and Food Act that includes some of these reforms. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in this farm bill to put some reasonable limits on who can receive subsidies and the amount they can receive. We are trying in our advocacy to really highlight the fact that that those are the problems that need to be addressed in the farm bill, and not as Speaker McCarthy and some other members of the House have proposed, not to try to make it harder for poor people to get access to food assistance. We don't think the biggest challenge with our farm programs is that we're feeding too many people. Frankly, the biggest challenge is that there are too many hungry people. We need to, a much bigger challenge is that too many of our farm subsidies are going to folks who are very successful and are using those farm subsidies to outbid their smaller neighbors for land and other costs of farming.
Thanks, Scott. More questions are coming in also from our viewers on Facebook as well. So we'll switch in. Some folks want to learn a little bit more about specific users of EQIP that are not climate smart. They want to understand what then are truly climate smart ways of growing. Someone's asking about demand for meat. So just understanding the scope of EQIP and what is good and what are we encouraging that EQIP should support and fund versus not support and fund.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. It's a great question. And I think anyone who's listening is sort of surprised to hear that a program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program is paying farmers, according to USDA, not according to EWG, to adopt practices that increase greenhouse gas emissions. The most common of these is paying farmers to build what are called manure lagoons or animal waste lagoons. These are big open pits that are used to store manure. As you can imagine, that produces a lot of methane emissions, and methane emissions being much more powerful than carbon dioxide emissions. And unfortunately, between 2018 and 2021, we, the taxpayers, through USDA, provided $147 million to farmers to build manure lagoons, again, which increase greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we turned away tens of thousands of farmers who were offering to share the cost of practices that could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in particular by changing how they use fertilizer in ways that would reduce the amount of nitrous oxide. It's 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, that would reduce nitrous oxide emissions into the atmosphere, or change how they're feeding animals or managing manure to reduce methane emissions. So fortunately, Senator Booker of New Jersey has teamed up with Senator Mike Lee of Utah, to change the formula we use to allocate funding for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program to reduce the amount of support for practices like manure storage lagoons. So I think there's a real opportunity to make some progress in this farm bill, to send the right signal to farmers to say, hey, look, we'll pay more for the practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and pay less for the practices that that increase greenhouse gas emissions or don't provide many environmental benefits. And just note that my colleague Jeff added to the chat some background information on EQIP, as well as our colleagues at Earth Justice, their analysis of the true impact of agriculture on the climate.
Thanks, Scott. Super helpful. So I just encourage folks to review those resources. And you've already started talking about Congress and advocacy strategies. So I'm just going to lean into some of those questions here. Folks are asking, I think you mentioned Senator Booker, you've mentioned Senator Shaheen. Are there any other particular legislators that they should focus their advocacy on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you are interested in learning more about Senator Booker and Senator Lee's bill to change the signals that we send through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, you should definitely reach out to Jeff, and he's just put in the chat some more information about that bill, or myself, and we'll put our email addresses in there. And I know Senator Booker would greatly appreciate being able to add your organizations to the list of supporters that he's developed. Senator Shaheen has not yet reintroduced her bill to place reasonable limits on who can receive crop insurance subsidies and the amount that they can receive, and nor has Congressman Blumenauer. So if you are interested in supporting those bills, again, please reach out to Jeff or myself, and we're happy to connect you with their staff so that you can lend your organization or individual name to the list that they'll be building of supporters. There are many other members of Congress who are advocating for many of these policy reforms. First and foremost is the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Senator Debbie Stabenow. She's been a great champion for trying to increase funding for climate smart practices, and was the primary champion for the $20 billion that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now's a really important time to tell your legislators that money should not be cut. There are efforts underway right now as we watch this presentation to cut some of that $20 billion to increase farm subsidies, which is crazy. As you saw from earlier from our presentation, the lion's share of those subsidies goes to the largest and most successful farmers. And according to USDA, many of those farmers are enjoying farm household income of more than $1 million a year. They are literally the last people in the country who need a raise right now. And it simply defies common sense to cut funding that would go to farmers who are offering to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to help increase subsidies to the largest and most successful farmers in the country. So please reach out to your legislators, your senators, your House members, and let them know that we shouldn't cut funding for the climate smart spending in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's also really important, as I said, also at the top, is to say that we certainly shouldn't be making it harder to feed hungry people. And as I mentioned, there are efforts underway by House Republicans to make it harder to feed hungry people by placing new work requirements and other obstacles in the way of hungry people. So if you're reaching out to your members of Congress, please say, don't cut climate smart funding to increase subsidies. Also say, please make sure we feed hungry people. And then the last thing is, again, weighing in support of these reasonable subsidy reforms to help our family farmers so that they're not at a competitive disadvantage with their larger neighbors.
Thanks, Scott. So many items in there, and thanks for reiterating the things we need to advocate for. I know you've mentioned some marker bills, and I know someone else has asked about the Agriculture Resilience Act. So there's tons of marker legislations that I would just encourage folks to on EWG and other spaces to review and decide to sign on to. We will be sharing some of the links and resources that have been mentioned by Scott and Jeff as well in the follow-up space. Let's see. So some things folks want to hear, particularly someone had asked about the food not feed issue. If you could talk a little bit more about that, as well as farming provisions around forest land and forest stewardship. One of the titles in the Farm Bill is forestry, and so that is a big piece of it as well. And that oftentimes is what people think about when they think about conservation, rather than climate emissions from farming practices. So.
Yeah, no, I'm so grateful for these questions. One of the a bit of analysis that we'll put in the chat shows that we have overwhelmingly not only subsidized the production of feed grains, as you saw from the slides. I'm happy to share the slides with anyone who'd like to see them. Not only are we giving 45 to 65% of our subsidies to the production of feed grains. We've also provided over $50 billion in subsidies to livestock operators in other ways since 1995. EWG did some recent analysis, and we'll put that in the chat for you. By contrast, we've provided virtually no support for the companies and farmers that are producing plant-based options to meat and dairy. And while we're certainly not advocating or telling people what to eat, we certainly ought to do more to make it easier for folks to occasionally, once in a while, replace an animal protein with a plant-based protein if they're not going to choose a vegan or vegetarian diet. Unfortunately, our Farm Bill does virtually nothing to support the farmers and the food manufacturers who are producing those plant-based products. We provide very little support for the folks producing pulse crops and oats and other ingredients that go into plant-based foods. We provide very little support for the companies that turn those ingredients into the foods we eat. And we do very little to promote those products in the United States or around the globe. So there are big opportunities in the Farm Bill to try to help scale up plant-based options. That's not only great for the climate, and it's not only great for our personal health, it's really great for the farmers who produce those crops and for all the workers, the mostly rural workers who turn those ingredients into the things that we love. So hopefully we'll see some real progress in this Farm Bill on that front.
Thanks, Scott. And just looking at some comments that are being made, dietary changes within the Farm Bill, definitely that is a collaboration between USDA and some of the research that they do, but the reality is that the dietary recommendations that the government has, we do not subsidize in any way. And as Scott was saying, the number of farmers that are growing plant-based specialty crops, as they are called, get very few subsidies. And in fact, as of 2017, 2019, only about 3% of farmland in the US grew specialty crops, so plants, vegetables, seeds. So we definitely are not feeding our communities, and we're not feeding ourselves. Scott, I want to switch really quickly to some racial equity concerns in the Farm Bill. Someone has asked about specifically the Congressional Black Caucus and the Vice President, what they feel about the Farm Bill, and whether senior legislators like Senator Tim Scott, who are Black, have any interest in the Farm Bill, thinking about Black farmers and people of color who are doing community farms, et cetera. How are they represented, especially within this regenerative agriculture and climate-friendly practices, and who is championing that Black farmers and farmers of color have a stake in this space?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And there are a lot of great organizations that are working on behalf of farmers of color. And as many of you know, there has been some effort in the last few years to try to provide some justice to farmers who were denied loans and other benefits from USDA, although didn't go clearly as far as we need to. There are lots of opportunities to try to adjust some of the inequity that's really baked into these farm programs. One way that our farm programs continue to discriminate against farmers of color is by tying commodity subsidies to a farmer's production history. And without getting too far into the weeds, the commodity subsidies they talked about, which make about half of the farm safety net, are tied to your production history. Well, if you've been denied loans and other supports that your white neighbors have received for many, many decades, you have not built the same kind of production history if you are a farmer of color who's been the victim of discrimination. So by linking commodity subsidy payments to that production history, or what are called base acres in the Farm Bill, really just enshrines that history of racism in our farm safety net. The other way that our farm safety net really reinforces historical racism is because it's relied more and more on crop insurance. Again, those crop insurance payments are tied to your overall revenue. So if you're a big, successful farmer and you are selling more products from more acres of land, the amount of subsidy that you will receive will be significantly greater. What's more is that there is a farmer copay. And if you're a BIPOC farmer with limited resources, you are much less likely to be able to provide the on average 40% that farmers have to pay in order to buy insurance. And because we don't know who gets insurance, because Congress has prohibited us from knowing who gets insurance, we don't know for sure what we all suspect, which is that the vast majority of crop insurance for subsidy recipients are white farmers, and generally very large white farmers, not farmers of color. So there are big opportunities to try to address these historical equity issues in the Farm Bill. No one has done more on that than Senator Booker. Senator Warren has also been a really terrific leader on these issues. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see a focus on how to right some of these wrongs, but also not just provide justice for people who were denied loans and other supports in the past, but restructure our farm safety net so we're not simply reinforcing all that historic racism in this Farm Bill and subsequent farm bills.
Great, thanks, Scott. I just want to pause quickly. I know there's a couple of questions here that are asking around like who we're partnering with, what are the caucuses and consensus building. And Madison, who will be coming up shortly, will talk about specifically in the faith community, how we're partnering with progressive partners and interfaith partners as well to move the Farm Bill along. And some questions around some successful strategies on subsidies as well. I think we're sharing some resources, and I think Scott has touched on the reality is that this is still an uphill battle, right, to move those subsidies from the big ag to smaller farmers. So it's an ongoing space. The last thing that Scott, I think folks would love to know in terms of the timeline. Where are we state of play right now with the farm bills? If we can wrap up with that, where are we state of play, hearings, meetings with members of Congress, the bill passage as well. Folks would just like to know what can still be done and what room they have to make impact.
Yeah, no, this is a great time to raise your voice. And so the Farm Bill will expire on September 30th. The Congress is trying to pass a new Farm Bill by September 30th. We should all be operating as though that will happen. There are hearings underway now. Hearings have occurred. There are hearings happening this week, next week. I expect that we'll see a Farm Bill sometime on the floor of the House and perhaps the Senate this summer. There are lots of reasons to think that might not happen, especially the fight over the debt limit. But we should all assume that it could happen. If the Farm Bill does not get renewed by September 30th, and that has happened in the past, oftentimes Congress will pass a bill that provides a short-term deadline, say to the end of the calendar year, or a one-year extension. Those are certainly possibilities, but I certainly wouldn't count on them. And so now is the time to raise your voice. The faith community's voice has always been extraordinarily important in trying to bring attention to the need to reform our farm safety net to help the family farmers who are really in need of help and to address these longstanding equity issues. So now is a great time to raise your voice.
Thanks, Scott. So many other questions are popping in as we have a lot of people joining us today. We're so grateful for your time. We will be saving the chat and the Q&A to make sure that we answer certain things and provide resources to address that. And so just ask that you stay posted. And for the ask, somebody in particular said to hear the asks that Scott had, we will summarize those and include them in the follow-up email as well. Scott has also shared his email address, and I will pass it on to Madison to close us out today. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Scott, and all of our friends here who joined today in this really wonderful webinar to learn about the Farm Bill. I don't know about you, but I thought it was a wonderful time of learning and sharing together. So thank you all so much. We'll definitely be in touch. We have recorded this webinar, so we'll be sending around the recording and with all of the resources that were shared. So be on the lookout for that information and also some next steps for taking action. Thank you all so much, and we'll be in touch. Have a wonderful day.